Hello out there, and in front of you today are a few Kizer Vanguard knives, and what we have from top to bottom are the Dukes, we have the Begleiter, and the Sovereign. And I wanted to do reviews on all three of these knives, but just the number of knives that I need to get to and the amount of time that I have on my hands made it make sense for me to consolidate these into one video where I just talk about the Vanguard line as a whole. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to go through the things I think you need to know about Vanguard knives, and over the course of the video, I'm sure just all the details of these knives will be explained, at least enough for you to understand what my recommendation would be. So without any further ado, let's get into the top 10 things you need to know about the Kizer Vanguard line, starting with number 1, types of Kizers. Because a year ago today, I would have had no idea what a Vanguard knife was. At that point, I had never held a Kizer, didn't own one, didn't know really anything about them. And so the best way that I can break it down is to say that the Vanguard line is a more inexpensive line of knives from Kizer, and a lot of those are cheaper versions of their high-end lines. And so the higher-end Kizers, for the most part, use S35 VN and titanium as the main materials. And those higher-end knives can be broken down into two subcategories. This Kizer Wakola is part of the Bladesmith series, which basically has designers that you might have heard of, like Steve Jernigan designed this. So the designs for the Bladesmith series are outsourced to, popular designers of knives. Then we have the Prime series of knives, which is Kizer's in-house designs, like this Envoy, also with S35 VN and titanium. And so when we go back to the Vanguard series, what you'll see is a lot of designs that you might recognize from the higher end knives, but just with more inexpensive materials. And so that brings us into number 2, unique builds. Because of these knives on the table, 2 of them are actually more inexpensive representations of some of the higher end knives, but one is a unique and individual build that was just for the Vanguard line. So the Dukes here has a higher end version. The Sovereign here, at one point, I'm not sure if it's still in production, but it did have a higher end version. But the Begleiter, I believe, was designed just for the Vanguard line. And so that's pretty cool. What that tells me is that they're not just taking, pre-existing designs and dumbing them down to make more money. They are putting a little bit of time and creativity into this line. The Barbosa that I used to have, which was my first ever Kizer actually, that one does not have a higher end version yet either. So, that was designed essentially just for the Vanguard line, which is very cool that they do stuff like that. Number 3. Cheaper, but not cheap. And here we're talking about materials, because it's really easy when you look at, knife companies that have an expensive line and then a more budget line. It's really easy to think that it's just a cast off and, like I said, a way to increase profits just by making a good design with cheap materials. But even though this isn't the highest end Kizer that you can find, they're not cheaping out with these at all. I mean, we have some really nice G10. We have VG10 is the steel for these knives. So these are good quality pieces. This is nothing to scoff at. And you can just see just how nicely they did all the work on the G10 here. I'm really happy with the materials. The VG10 that they use, in my experience, it's been performing really well. And so yeah, just because you have a cheaper line, it doesn't mean that it is cheap at all. So definitely something to keep in mind. And that sort of leads us into attention to detail. And I'm going to spend a few minutes here on this with each knife, because there are so many little details with all these knives that are impressive when it comes to the quality of construction. All right, and we'll just start at the top. And all of these knives that you'll see do have a good choil for sharpening. So that right off the bat is a big win. But as you look at this G10, I brought this up to the camera just a minute ago. Just look at how nice this is. There's a very good attention to detail here. There's also multiple color configurations for most of these knives. So yeah, it looks to me like a lot of time and design work and quality has gone in to making this knife. The titanium version of this Dukes certainly doesn't have the kind of milling that this G10 does, so again, there are some extra steps that are being taken in order to make a good quality knife. One other thing about this one is you can see we have these inset liners, but there's a lot of milling on the inset liners, and I can't tell you how often I've seen that. That's pretty cool. You know, a lot of times you see liners on knives that are milled, but inset ones that are milled too. You know, usually when they're inset, that by itself cuts enough weight, and so you don't get that milling. But again, just another extra step here. Talking about the beg lighter when it comes to detail, this one is probably the least impressive visually because to me it resembles a Ganzo. And not that Ganzos are bad, but it sort of does like hearken to that style. And so, you know, it does look a little bit more like cheaper knives would. But one thing about this that is really cool, and if I can get this focused with all the other stuff on the table, hopefully you'll be able to understand it. All right, so take a look at where the G10 scale meets the liners of the knife. All right. There's like chamfering on the scale, but then there's chamfering on the liner as well. And so it creates this really nicely machined like transition from the scale up to the liner back down to the scale. And it's not sharp at all. It's really smooth and it's just interesting. And I'm sorry for being out of focus for so long. But what I'm going to do actually is bring in a Kershaw leak that's sitting on the table, and you'll get an idea of what like a liner lock scale will usually look like. You know, you'll have maybe a little bit of like of texturing or chamfering on the actual scale itself, but it'll just be flush with the liner like this one. And hopefully, you know, it was focused enough for you to see that they just took an extra step here. One other thing with this knife and all of the other knives that you'll see in this line is that the G10 is all different. So it's not like they're pumping this all out of a factory and just putting, you know, cutting the G10 to size and putting it on different knives. I mean, all of these models have their own type of G10. Continuing with attention to detail, talking about the Sovereign real quickly. Again, that G10 is just a huge win. This is definitely the largest and the most overbuilt of the knives, and a really nice touch on this one is that it uses T8 hardware all the way across the board instead of T6. So, you know, definitely something that the bigger the knife is, the stronger it needs to be, and so they do have that attention to detail. And so I'm impressed with that pretty much across the board. The level of quality and commitment that they had to making a good product definitely shows. Next, action. Action is on point. I'm going to have to move some of this stuff out for a quick second while we demonstrate that. Of these three, the one with the worst or less impressive, let's just say, action is the beg lighter. It's just a on washers, thumb stud. It's fine. Action is fine on this one. Perfectly functional. It's also been the most inexpensive of the three. But the ones that really impress me, the Sovereign, this big knife with this flipper, flips really well. Flips really well. Also on washers, I believe, and just a really good smooth knife. Also has that thumb stud option, so that's very cool. But the most impressive ones were, one, the Barbosa that I sold, and then this knife right here, the Dukes. That's some of the best action, man, that's some of the best action I have on a knife, period. And honestly, guys, I talked about this in my top 10 knives of 2017. This is one of the best knives that I own, period. It's great. I can't say enough about this, and the action is just what makes it so good. It flips beautifully on bearings, great quality, very smooth. Can't really ask for anything more than what that gives. Next, liner lock quality. So that's one of the big differences too between this series and the more expensive series, is that you have liner locks on most of these knives versus the frame locks that a lot of stuff with the titanium and S35 VN has. But the good news is that the lockup on every one of these has been excellent. Excellent. So they just did a really good job with it. No movement whatsoever. Standout, and that's sort of what the expectation is that I have whenever I buy a knife. And I mean, these just are vaults. It's really well done, well executed, and really strong. I mean, you can see how thick the liners are on this big knife. So very sturdy. Great job on those liners. All right, now let's get to one sort of negative. I'm a big guy for packaging. If you didn't know this already, I keep my knives in their boxes. I don't get rid of boxes. I don't store them in a Pelican case or anything else. So packaging for me is a big deal. And it doesn't match the quality of the knife, which is sort of a bummer. It's sort of like this clamshell in a cardboard box kind of thing. So not a huge fan of that. Not a deal breaker by any stretch of the imagination at all, but just not a huge fan. Now, one thing that sort of makes up for that is that each of these Vanguard knives does come with a nice little Kaiser polishing cloth. So that is pretty cool. You do have that added level of quality and that nice extra touch there. But it would be nice to have, something a little bit, a little bit more sturdy. I don't know what the word is. Sturdy. More well put together, let's say. All right, next. Cheaper but not cheap, part 2. And now we're talking about price, and we're getting into price point of all these knives. I'm going to talk a little bit about ways to get these knives at a less expensive price in a minute or two. But cheaper not cheap means that these are not budget knives. Just because they're from a more inexpensive line of knives, you're still going to pay some good money for them. The Sovereign here goes for $75. I believe the Beg Lighter is one of the cheapest Vanguards that is out there, right around $50 or $55. And the Dukes, that one runs at like the $75 price range as well. So again, these are good quality knives. They're less expensive than the more high-end Kaisers, but you're still going to pay good money for them, and with good reason. Hopefully, I've shown that already. Next, preferable to the high end. And this is just food for thought. This is a little bit of a debate, because the reason why I got this Kaiser Dukes down here at the bottom was because I really wanted the high-end knife. I wanted the titanium one. It's just a gorgeous piece. And visually, just for me, it's almost as good as a design can possibly be. So just love the look of that knife. And I wanted to get the smaller version, basically to test out, to find out if I wanted to save up for the more expensive one. And now that I have this Dukes, I do not need the more expensive one. And I say preferable to the higher end because the materials in these knives are so good and the action and everything is so good that some people just prefer G10 to titanium. And some people don't mind VG10 versus S35VN. For me, the difference in price, I think the higher end version of this is around $200. For me, this knife is everything that I'm going to need it to be. So I don't need the more expensive one when it comes to this. And honestly, I sort of lost interest in it because, I do just prefer G10 in general. And this isn't some crap G10, as we've talked about already. It's great G10, and VG10 steel does the job for me. So yeah, I'm set with that. And I know there's a lot of people, just depending on your preference and what you need the knife for, that, with this knife being heavier duty and, a much bigger build, the way that you're going to apply it, you might want a G10 handle scale and not titanium. So just a lot of stuff to think about when it comes to that debate and whether you do need to make the investment for the more expensive versions. And finally, let's close with purchasing suggestions, since we're already talking about that. I was fortunate enough to get these two knives down here when the Vipon app was an active thing and there were Kaisers for like 50% off all the time. Unfortunately, that's no longer the case. The Vipon app is sort of not really working when it comes to Kaisers. Kaiser's not involved with that anymore. You can find their really budget Tangram series on Vipon every now and then. So definitely check that out if you wanted to see those knives, because those are only like $20 or $25 on there, which is a good deal. But what I have seen is I've seen some Kaisers on Mass Drop, and I actually got this Wakola from Mass Drop. But my purchasing suggestion is wait until you see one of these at a very good price, because it'll come along somewhere at a really nice discount if you do enough searching. On Mass Drop, there are some good deals and some not so good deals, but the Kaisers that I've seen on there are just really nicely priced. So, when you are going and looking for one of these, definitely do your due diligence and try to find the best price that you can, because even though I said like $75, $50, you should be able to get these at significantly cheaper prices if you keep your eye out for long enough. All right, guys. And one other thing to say is that when you're comparing prices, $75 this versus a Delica, like I said, it's comparable. So even at full price, I think you're getting a good purchase. But anyway, guys, any questions, comments, complaints, suggestions, let me know down below. What's your experience with the Kaiser lines in general? What do you think? Do you like the Vanguard ones? Do you like the more high-end ones? I like them all so far, but I'd really like to hear your take on it as well. So I'll talk to you soon. Hopefully hear from you down below, but have a good one, and thanks for watching. Take care.